He was a talented, successful, and wealthy software engineer, not only brilliant and hardworking. He was also a kind-hearted man who always put family first. His life seemed flawless, a picture of perfection without a single blemish. She, on the other hand, was a girl born in a poor rural town where dreams of education never materialized. With no diploma, no prospects, her world was confined to a handful of scribbled words and endless days of grueling survival. They belonged to two entirely different realms, separated not just by thousands of miles, but by the vast chasm of fate. They should have had no connection whatsoever. Yet, destiny pulled them together in a way no one could have foreseen, only to thrust them mercilessly into a brutal spiral from which escape was impossible. Let's rewind to 2002 and dive into a tale woven with money, deception, love, and vengeance. A story where dark secrets lurk beneath a glamorous facade, and every choice comes with a steep price. San Marcos, a small city in central Texas with a population exceeding 400,000, has a history marked by dramatic turns. Once a quiet agricultural hub, it was transformed during World War II when the U.S. military established Randolph Air Force Base nearby, turning it into a strategic hub. The military presence brought waves of immigrants and drew countless locals seeking work. At its peak, San Marcos buzzed with life, especially after dark, when neon lights and pulsing music filled the air. Foreign soldiers drowned themselves in liquor and endless revelry alongside women draped in dazzling, seductive allure. Though the military eventually pulled out, the city retained its lively spirit. Bars, casinos, and karaoke lounges sprouted like weeds, making it a notorious hotspot in Texas, infamous for its wild nightlife. It earned a chilling nickname, the City of Sin, and it was here that our story unfolded. James Carter, a brilliant young software engineer, had risen to a leadership role at a company in Texas, earning over $60,000 a year, a fortune by any standard. He was the epitome of a life's victor. Born on March 27, 1970, in Cleveland, Ohio, James grew up in an ordinary family. His parents had 3 children, and as the eldest, he had 2 younger sisters. As a child, James was a bit mischievous, but still a good kid, always close to his family. Their lives flowed peacefully, almost idyllically, until tragedy struck when he was 14. His father died in a car accident, leaving an infallible void. Overnight, the innocent boy became a man. As the only male left in the household, James took on the burden of caring for his mother and sisters. From that moment, he grew fiercely dedicated, ensuring they never lacked for anything. Years later, his mother remarried a man named Alan, who brought joy back to the family. Alan bonded with the 3 kids and quickly became a new pillar of support, freeing James to pursue his passion, computers. Whenever he had a spare moment, he'd sit in front of the screen, tirelessly tinkering with every detail. He didn't hang out with friends or care for social gatherings, but that independence fueled his astonishing achievements. After years of self-teaching, James mastered not just hardware, but programming, a rare and promising skill in the 1980s. Predictably, his talent landed him his first job, making his family proud. From there, he poured his heart into his career. At 21, his exceptional abilities caught the eye of a company in Seattle, offering him triple his current salary to join them. The offer was too tempting to resist. It was also a chance to see the world. His mother, Elizabeth, though reluctant to let him go, didn't want to hold him back. She gave her blessing, and off he went. Keep Elizabeth's name in mind. She's a key figure in this story. With his new job, James threw himself into work, quickly carving out a solid reputation in Seattle. His high salary and smooth career made life comfortable, even luxurious. But no matter how busy he got, weekends were for unwinding. Back then, the elite often flocked to San Marcos, known for having the biggest red light district in Texas, a playground of casinos, bars, lounges, and endless entertainment, all at affordable prices. James and his colleagues were no exception, heading there to blow off steam. Unlike most who sought out bar girls, James had a different obsession. Soaring through the sky, he was hooked on paramotoring and joined a local club in San Marcos. Whenever he could, he'd climb into his rig and launch into the air, chasing the thrill of absolute freedom. One night, James stepped into a bar where dim lights cast dreamy glows on radiant faces. Amid the blaring music and swirling liquor, his gaze locked on a young, innocent face, exactly his type. Without hesitation, he approached her, chose her, and took her out for the night. In San Marcos bars, girls like her were common, products of impoverished families with no chance at education. To survive, they entered this glitzy underworld, dancing for tips or selling their bodies for a few bucks. At the time, a night of dancing earned them about $1, while a night with a client could fetch $5. After a few days together, James was convinced this girl was his fate. Without a second thought, he shelled out $500 to buy her freedom from the bar owner. Her name was Lydia Torres, from Eagle Pass, a struggling border town in Texas. There, clean water and electricity were luxuries, and homes were little more than shacks. Survival was a daily battle. Education was a distant dream. Girls in her village grew up hoping to work in bars, praying a wealthy man would spot them and transform their lives from rags to riches. Lydia left home at 13, heading solo to bustling San Marcos. She danced in bars, earning a measly $1 a night, still better than back home, where at least she had food and decent clothes. Like countless others, she dreamed of a handsome, rich foreigner swooping in to save her. To her, James was that savior. Young, good-looking, kind, and most importantly, loaded, her ideal man. During their time together, Lydia played the part perfectly. Sweet, submissive, affectionate, melting James' heart. He fell deeper every day, eventually hatching a wild plan to marry her. Despite knowing her past, he kept the full truth from his parents, simply saying Lydia came from a poor rural town, hadn't gone to school, and once worked in a bar. His mother, Elizabeth, assumed it was just a regular bar like those in Ohio and didn't pry. In 1997, Elizabeth and her husband flew to Seattle to visit James. It was their first meeting with Lydia. She acted polite and proper, but after a few days, Elizabeth felt uneasy. The gap between her son and this girl was glaring. A high-flying tech expert and an uneducated bar worker with little in common. They seemed worlds apart. But James adored Lydia like a treasure, so Elizabeth held her tongue, hoping they'd make it work. In March 1997, James and Lydia tied the knot in Seattle. She was just 17, but borrowed her sister's ID to fake being 21, since she was too young to marry legally. Soon after, Lydia got pregnant and gave birth to their daughter, Sophie. 2 years later, their son, Ethan, arrived. The family of four brimmed with joy and laughter. Not long after Ethan's birth, James decided to move to Texas, back to San Marcos, where he'd met Lydia. Beyond nostalgia, there was a practical reason. His company had opened a branch in Austin, and he'd been named director with a $5,000 monthly salary, a top-tier income in Texas at the time. He rented a mansion in an upscale San Marcos neighborhood, a 3-hour drive from work, for his wife and kids. He gave Lydia $1,000 a month for spending money, equivalent to a year's earnings for most locals. He also hired a maid to handle chores and childcare, none other than Lydia's sister. With everything taken care of, Lydia lived a life of leisure. In just a few years, she'd gone from being a bar dancer scraping by on $1 a night to a wealthy wife with $1,000 to burn each month. Her family back in Eagle Pass reaped the benefits too. James sent her father a hefty sum to buy a fishing boat and build the village's first brick house. Thanks to James, Lydia and her kin had struck gold, becoming the envy of their town. For James, life was a dream, happy family, thriving career, beautiful wife, obedient kids. But human greed knows no bounds. A meticulously planned murder was closing in on him. On July 17th, 2002, a typical Wednesday, James and his colleague David stayed late at the office until 10 p.m. By the time they got back to their rented apartment near work, it was 10:45. Exhausted, James collapsed into bed and passed out. David, however, couldn't sleep. His girlfriend was flying in from Seattle to reunite with him, and he was too excited to rest. At 1 a.m., he picked her up from the airport and brought her home. After settling in, they drifted off. But soon, David's girlfriend sent something off. Footsteps outside, a flashlight flickering through the door crack. David thought maybe James was up, but before he could call out, the door burst open. 3 strangers stormed in, guns drawn. One aimed at David's head and barked a question in English. When David shook his head, they bolted to the next room, James's. Seconds later, for deafening gunshots rang out, followed by frantic footsteps pounding down the stairs and a car engine roaring into the night. It happened so fast that by the time David snapped out of his shock, it was too late. James lay lifeless in a pool of blood. David called the police, and an ambulance rushed James to the hospital. But he was gone. David tried reaching Lydia, but it took her 4 hours to pick her up. He assumed she'd notified James's parents in Ohio, but she didn't. Left with no choice, David called Elizabeth himself. Hearing her son was murdered, Elizabeth froze, her body trembling as she collapsed into a chair. It took an hour for her to steady herself enough to book a flight to Texas with her husband. 2 days later at the funeral home, they saw their son again, but only as a cold, lifeless shell. Devastated, Elizabeth and her husband went straight to the police for answers, perhaps fearing diplomatic trouble over an American citizen's death, or some hidden reason. The San Marcos police investigation moved suspiciously fast. Within a day, they pegged it as a business dispute, suggesting a rival or partner had targeted James. But Elizabeth wasn't convinced. If it was about business, why was David unharmed? And David recalled a critical detail. The gunman had asked, "Is he the one?" They were hunting a specific target. Days later, the police flipped their story, calling it a botched robbery. Elizabeth didn't buy it. Her suspicions zeroed in on Lydia, and she grew certain her daughter-in-law was hiding something. "In all my years," she later said, "I've never been more sure of anything. Lydia is behind this." Her hunch wasn't just a gut feeling. It was built on chilling clues. First, when James was killed, Lydia didn't call his family. David did. What kind of wife stays silent after her husband's murder? Second, at the funeral home, Lydia didn't greet them or offer comfort. She acted like a stranger, her face blank, not a tear shed. Her first words were, "Have you seen David? Did he say anything?" Then she brought up money. That coldness was damning. Third, Lydia let slip that the killers were in the apartment for over 20 minutes, a detail the police hadn't released. How did she know? Fourth, months earlier, during a visit to Texas, Elizabeth had secretly filmed Lydia sneaking off to make a call, laughing gleefully. It seemed odd then, now it screamed suspicion. Fifth, James had once confided in Elizabeth that his marriage was crumbling. Lydia did nothing but spend, even stealing from him, neglecting their kids while demanding more. Sixth, while sorting James's belongings, Elizabeth found a pawn slip dated 2 weeks before his death. The item? His wedding ring. The pawn? Lydia. Seventh, when Elizabeth had tried paying Lydia's rent earlier, the landlord dropped a bombshell. When James was at work, Lydia brought men home constantly, turning the place into a noisy mess. He'd nearly evicted them. The pieces formed a sinister picture. Lydia was hiding something dark, and every clue pointed to her involvement in James's death. Elizabeth took her findings to the San Marcos police, but they brushed her off, citing insufficient evidence. Crime was rampant there, robberies, assaults, petty thefts, and they lacked the manpower to dig into every case, especially without media or political pressure. Desperate, Elizabeth turned to the U.S. Embassy in Austin, but they were equally indifferent, used to the chaos of San Marcos and skeptical results. They gently suggested she leave. Hearing that, Elizabeth felt the ground drop beneath her. Alone in a strange place, abandoned by the authorities. What could she do? That indifference likely emboldened the killers. But Elizabeth wasn't just a grieving mother. She was a force of reckoning. She refused to let her son's death go unpunished. Even if the world turned its back, she'd fight to the end so James could rest in peace. Going it alone was perilous. A local warned her, anyone profiting from James's death would see her as a threat, and threats get eliminated. She could be next. Undeterred, Elizabeth transformed from a mourning mother into a relentless avenger. She bought notebooks, a recorder, and investigation tools, meticulously dissecting every detail. Why was Lydia so broke? What was she spending on? Who was she secretly calling a lover? Who were the men sneaking into her home when James was away? Were they the killers? Solo sleuthing was impossible, so she hired a local private investigator with a hefty fee, tasking him to tail Lydia 24/7. She also reached out to Lydia's friends, family, and neighbors, offering cash for intel. Surprisingly, it worked like a charm. Colleagues of James revealed his marriage had rotted long ago. Early on there was love, but lately it was war. Lydia had a lover and blew through money, even stealing from James. Her neglect hit a peak when he discovered their daughter, Sophie, wasn't in school. Lydia had pocketed the tuition. Furious but hopeful, James confronted her, begging her to ditch the affair and save their marriage. He gave her two options: get an education or a job. But Lydia, addicted to her cushy life, refused. James cut off her allowance, a bold move that could push her to extremes. Colleagues warned him to watch his back, but he stayed calm. Tension skyrocketed until James moved out, renting an apartment near work in Austin, drowning his sorrows in bars to escape her chaos. Another clue emerged. Lydia was cozy with a man named Victor. They were spotted in intimate embraces, likely her lover. The PI, after days of surveillance, caught two men sneaking into Lydia's house. One was Victor. He snapped clear photos, and this time the police acted. They nabbed Victor and his buddy, Marcus, a fellow thug. Ironically, Elizabeth had to foot the bill for the cops' travel from Austin to San Marcos. Their budget was that tight. Then a key witness stepped up, David. He'd seen the killers that night and instantly recognized Victor and Marcus at the station. With his testimony, the pair were charged with murder on August 16, 2002. It should have been a victory, but the plot thickened. A sympathetic cop warned Elizabeth the case was murky. The U.S. Embassy sent an urgent letter: leave Texas now or face danger. Why? Victor and Marcus were ex-cops from a narcotics unit, tied to local gangs. Now facing murder charges, their allies might spring them or silence Elizabeth to bury the evidence. If she died, the case would vanish. After agonizing, she retreated temporarily to protect herself. But she was worried about Sophie and Ethan. Heeding the embassy, she planned to return to Ohio. But first, she tricked Lydia with a cash offer for Sophie's passport, claiming it was for a trip. Greedy, Lydia handed it over. In September 2002, Elizabeth and her husband fled San Marcos, safely bringing Sophie home. Though Victor and Marcus were caught, Elizabeth wasn't done. One killer, and the mastermind, remained free. Returning to Texas was suicide. The embassy warned her life was at stake. Lydia, furious about losing Sophie, sued Elizabeth for kidnapping, meaning arrest if she stepped foot in Texas. Still, Elizabeth pressed on remotely, emailing U.S. senators, lawyers, and the embassy to pressure San Marcos police. She kept the PI on payroll, digging through Lydia's circle. When police needed prodding, she paid for their gas. The costs were staggering, but she didn't flinch, even mortgaging her home. She also aimed to rescue Ethan. Lydia, enraged, spat through a mediator. Taking my daughter wasn't enough. Now my son? It was a veiled threat, heightening Elizabeth's fears for Ethan. Why did people help her? Cash aside, many despised Lydia. Once rich, she scorned her poor relatives with cruel words and deeds, turning allies into enemies. Her persistence paid off. A relative revealed Ethan was in Laredo with his grandparents. Elizabeth contacted them. They'd soured on Lydia since their ATM card vanished after her rise. She offered $3,000 to bring Ethan to Ohio. Seeing no future in raising him, they agreed. After a month of paperwork, Ethan arrived. Elizabeth was horrified. He was malnourished, eyes sunken, body frail, with rope marks on his ankles from being tied up. As she nursed him back to health, she kept digging. Months later, a breakthrough. Lydia's aunt named the third gunman, Nathan Brooks, husband of Lydia's sister, Tina. He'd fled after the murder, evading police. But on June 14, 2003, they tracked him down. Under pressure, Nathan cut a deal. He'd testify against Lydia for leniency. He admitted joining the hit on James, but Lydia was a puppeteer, guiding them, handing over keys, waiting in a car below. She bragged to Nathan about James's wealth, houses in Ohio, a fat life insurance policy. His death would make her rich. In November 2003, with Nathan's confession, Victor and Marcus faced trial. Tina testified too, confirming Lydia's affair with Victor and her plot to kill James for money to run off with him. The evidence aligned perfectly. Victor and Marcus got 30 years each, no parole, plus a $1,000 fine for James's kids. Nathan, for turning into the state's witness, dodged prison. Lydia was still at large. A war went out, but with Texas's sprawling terrain, catching her was like finding a needle in a haystack. Months passed with no trace. The police barely cared. Fugitives were routine. But Elizabeth couldn't rest with Lydia free. Then, at 6:30 p.m. on October 17, 2004, they found her in a remote hill country village, aided by a friend. Hauled Austin, Lydia screamed innocence, claiming she was just living normally. By now, her family had disowned her, some calling her a disgrace. Alone in custody, only her father visited. At trial, she denied everything, claiming an alibi, but her lies crumbled. The police had 14 witnesses in a watertight case. Lydia had none. On November 25, 2004, Elizabeth and her husband flew back to Texas to see justice served. In a cramped Austin courtroom, Lydia strutted in smugly, ignoring them. When the judge sentenced her to 40 years, no parole, her mask shattered, eyes wide with panic. Elizabeth didn't crave the death penalty. This was enough. She asked to see Lydia, who sat stone-faced, glasses on, refusing to stand. Asked about her kids, she said she missed them, but her expression was blank. Elizabeth left her a notebook with Sophie and Ethan's drawings, promising periodic updates on their lives. It was her final act of grace. She hoped Lydia would reflect behind bars. How had a woman handed a dream life, thrown it away? To Elizabeth, it was simple. Lydia never loved James, only his money. She was a predator who'd kill for it. Elizabeth's crusade made headlines. Papers hailed her as a fearless mother who battled impossible odds for justice. Without her, the case might have faded, killers roaming free. Her 14 witnesses and helpers faced threats, some relocated multiple times. Proof the culprits were cunning. Global attention forced the police to act, delivering a fair trial. For 2.5 torturous years, Elizabeth barely slept, spending nearly everything, mortgaging her home twice. She chronicled her fight in a book, For the Love of My Son, a raw account of her war against evil. And with that, her story ends, a testament to a mother's unbreakable resolve.